是女生不是男生。
因为你嘴巴
讲是男生，所以要
你说的是男生。
OK， 我再讲，这样没有错哈。好。
不过现场看起来好像男生比较少，男生还比较多。
好，那谢谢龙军的那个精彩的这个演讲。我们接下来是不是请这个第3位演讲者就是彭保罗嘛？哈，那个 Paul 是这个法国这个 University Paris 的 Holt 的那个副教授。那这几年到台湾当这个法国现代中国研究中心台北东部主任。那我们都知道，就是台北有这个破来，又变得很精彩，所以很多很重要的议题，他都有在台北的这个学术界里面有很多的这个贡献。那他今天要讲一个感觉很艰深的问题啊，就是低剂量这个叫做日本的低剂量辐射暴露争议及对台湾的意义。
谢谢老师，谢谢张老师。Maybe I will use English just to save more time. Actually, my English is as bad as my Chinese, but I think I can make a little quicker so we can save time for the discussion. My paper is in English, but we have some translation. 那个，对不起，因为省时间我会用英文，可能会比较快。但是每个 slide 都有中文。然后如果有一些我们讨论的时间如果有些东西就是听不懂我的英文，我会用中文补充一下。好，谢谢。So today my presentation will mainly focus on Japan, but although I will talk about Japan, I have Taiwan in my mind. And so the main question is how Taiwanese people and, well, first of all, the Atomic Energy Council, UNRW, and the society at large, and the political class also, how would they react to a disaster very similar to 311? 311 stands for Fukushima nuclear disasters. It's not just the day, March 11. It's, all what happened after March 11. I will use 311 as a keyword. So how would Taiwanese people would react to a disaster similar to 311? And especially as regards the risk perceptions regarding the low levels radiation and what the so-called, it's a long time, a very old controversy, more than 50 years history, and regarding the effects of low doses of radiation on human health. As you may know, for those who are familiar with the articles of Japan-based journalist Yu Lier, she writes every week in the Zheozheba. For those who read articles regularly, I guess you are familiar with this controversy and how it goes in Japan. And you know that many scholars, Japanese scholars, and also foreign scholars going to Japan have argued that under a cumulative dose of 100 millisievert a year, there would be no significant impact on human health. And, well, this stirs many controversies and reactions from the Fukushima citizen I would develop later. Yeah, this I already said, so I will develop later. So in particular, among those scholars who insisted on the limited effects of low doses on human health because he's still active, Professor Yamashita Shunichi used to be a specialist of radiation risk he's an epidemiologist, and he was based at the University of Nagasaki, so he had many interaction with the Hibakusha, the victims of Nagasaki nuclear bomb. And then immediately after 3/11, he was affected. He was sent to. He was promoted as vice director of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Fukushima City, and the University of Fukushima is based in Fukushima City, 50 kilometers from north from Fukushima Daiichi, so not so far actually. And he has repeatedly insisted on the limited effects of low doses on human health. Actually, even made mistakes in his own declaration, saying that doses of 1,000 millisieverts a year would not be dangerous. And then after he realized his mistakes and he said, "Oh no, not 1,000, but 100, and so on and so on." So this provoked a lot of controversy among citizens in Fukushima. For example, Professor Fukushima is, Yamashita is, and this man is Nakate. Mr. Nakate is used to be an anti-nuclear activist before Fukushima, but he quit the movement. And then after Fukushima, it took him 1 or 2 months to realize what was going on. And then when his children appeared some signs like blood in their nose, he was very shocked. And he was extremely shocked even by the declaration of Professor Yamashita. And he started a movement to protect Fukushima children. And now we have a lot of similar associations. But I think he was among the first one to do that. So now in Japan we have a very strong polarization of the two sides of this controversy regarding the effects of low doses. On one hand, we have a lot of Fukushima citizens, not all of them, but a lot, and this number is growing, who react against not only the lack of feeling of responsibility of the Japanese state, but also the authorities in Fukushima prefectures, but also this repeated declaration among the nuclear experts, or so-called experts, insisting on the non-significant risk of low doses. So in June this year, a group of more than 1,000 Fukushima residents decided to sue these state public officers and also these experts, among them Yamashita Shinichi. And what is very interesting as regards the long story of industrial pollution related litigation in Japan, they decided to go to the criminal court, not only the civil court, but criminal court. So to charge for criminal, to file a charge with criminal charge. On the other hand, since December 2011, the national TV broadcast NHK made a very interesting documentary movie about ICRP, International Commission on Radiation Protection. It was they wanted to highlight the long intimacy of RCRP members with the nuclear industry. Not to say that all RCRP members are totally involved or controlled by the nuclear industry, but to some extent. And so to some extent, the recommendation of RCRP were made under a strict control of the nuclear industry. So there was a very shocking documentary for the general public and also in particular for the Japanese member of RCRP. And from January this year until now, they have repeatedly threatened NHK with charges of libel. So they are doing this sort of, lobbying action to threaten NHK. But so what I mean here is we have a really strong polarization of the controversy. As my former fieldwork about regarding nuclear energy and nuclear risk is based on workers. I tend myself to focus on the experience of workers, but I think it's interesting not only for those who are doing the sociology of labor, but I think the situation of the workers in nuclear plants in general, and also those workers going to Fukushima Daiichi after the 311, holds very interesting topics for the situation, the current situation of Fukushima citizens. And I'm not the only one. Actually, Professor Kosako Toshiso is a professor at the University of Tokyo. He's not at all an anti-nuclear activist, far from that. But I mean, all his work has been with the nuclear industry for many years. But in the aftermath of 311, he was appointed as a consultant for the Japanese government for Mr. Kan. But at the end of April, he resigns from this position, and it was very emotional moment when he was on the NHK broadcast, and he cries on the television to say, "I can't accept the current recommendation when the Ministry of Education is willing to accept that children of Fukushima are exposed to a cumulative annual dose of 20 millisieverts." And he says, I cannot tolerate, because even if we look at the data of nuclear plant workers, this is very rare. Even nuclear plant workers are not exposed to such high, or only some of them are exposed to such high radiation risk. So this was a very emotional moment, and actually I met with some people in Fukushima prefecture who decided to commit themselves for the sake of Fukushima children because of this declaration. Professor Nagataki Shigenobu is an epidemiologist. He's a clinician. But he has done many research on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hibakusha, and also in Chernobyl. He argues that Professor Kosako regretted this. When I met him twice, and I think the second time he mentioned, "Oh yeah, Kosako said so, but actually he regrets having said so." And I had doubts, and I remember that this guy, Chris Busby, says some experts are used to lie. So I wondered, could it be? So I asked Professor Kosako for an interview, and I met him last June, and he said, "No, absolutely no. I don't regret this declaration. Of course, because of this, I have suffered from Murahazure. I forgot it means that because of this declaration, he had less contracts, research contracts with the nuclear industry and this sort of thing. But he does not regret to have said so." So yes, Professor Nagataki had lied to me, or maybe just transmitted a rumor. Well, actually, this declaration of Professor Kosako is interesting in many sense. That if we look at the current situation of Fukushima Prefecture, the whole prefecture does look like a vast, what we call in nuclear plant, what we call a controlled zone in Japanese, kanikuiki. It means the parts of the nuclear plant that are most contaminated with radiation risk, or contaminated, or which have the higher radiation risk. For example, this picture I took in last June in Koriyama Station. This is the clock as you have in all Japanese train station, in front of Japanese train station. But here you can notice the panel which indicates the current level of radiation. And by this time it was like 0.2 microsieverts, so this would make a 2.5 millisieverts a year, which is twice the average of current recommendation of the RCRP for average citizens. For nuclear plant workers, is 20 millisieverts, but for average citizens, 1 millisievert. So it's already twice the year average. And what does it mean? It's to say that, this is daily life. Now you have been to accustom yourself with this situation, to live in a current background with more radiation risk. And also, as mentioned by Professor Kosako, if we look at the data of nuclear plant workers, it's true, the number of workers who are exposed to a cumulative dose of 20 millisieverts a year are very few. From 2003 to 2009, this is for Japan, but all nuclear plants in Japan, so like 52 plants, there were only 21 workers who were exposed to a cumulative dose of 20 millisieverts a year. And if we look at the situation of Fukushima Daiichi in 2009, so the year previous 311, there was not even one. And this is quite surprising if we think that the Fukushima Daiichi is one of the oldest nuclear plants in Japan, meaning that the older a nuclear plant, the more radiation you have. But even though no worker were exposed to 20 millisieverts a year. Well, these are official data, and the problem is that a lot of, I will talk later about the problem of falsification. So it means that now the citizens of Fukushima Prefecture are encouraged to manage their radiation protection just like NP workers. The managing of radiation protection is a problem that is well studied by sociologists working on the issue of nuclear plant workers, but was not used to have this sort of problematic for citizens. And actually, I was saying this. I heard this expression from a nuclear expert from a French research institution who was sent to Japan after 311 to advise the French ambassador in Japan for the crisis management. And when I met him last September, he told me this. Yeah, you cannot expect the Japanese state, to deal with everything. Now the Japanese citizens, and in particular the citizens in Fukushima, have to deal with their own radiation. So the problem of falsification means that a lot of workers are compelled to falsify their own records so as not to overpass the year standard of 20 millisieverts. This was a guy I met in 2002 in Fukushima. He's a boss of a little company, and he was compelled to falsify the records of himself and also his colleagues, just as to be able to continue to work in the nuclear plants. This stamping made himself, just the situation is normal. To falsify the health document. Well, this sort of falsification was very frequent before 311, but after 311, it's also the case for all those workers going into Fukushima Daiichi. I forgot to say that before 311, the number of workers exposed to 20 millisieverts were not much, but after the situation at July 2012 is more than 4,000. And we don't know what would be the real measure if because a lot of workers use this sort of, it was revealed in July this year that some workers used lead cover to falsify their radiation dosimetry. And because of this, it's obvious that all the data we have are not really matching the current situation. And so the number of workers who have been certified for occupational cancer so far, only six, from 1935 to 2009. And actually, the cumulative dose is not that high. For example, between 50 and 100 millisieverts a year. No, for the all carrier, not a year, for the all carrier. So after 311, the health ministry said that they will not make a follow-up for the health situation of those workers under 50 millisieverts a year. And also no records for international contamination less than 2 millisieverts. Meaning that the data are even, incomplete. So this is interesting to think, a situation interesting to think about. What is the, what should the Fukushima citizens do, to go or not to go? And then we see that they are in a very complicated situation. If they leave Fukushima prefecture, they will be confronted to the difficult living condition, economic condition, and psychological problems inherent to exile. So we can call this the moral risk. But if they stay in Fukushima, they have a higher risk of having a cancer sooner than and in bigger proportion than the rest of the population. So in other words, they are between the risk of to die of cancer or to die of melancholia. And I think for those doing STS, Sociology of Science, we should not privilege one or the other risk. We should keep that tension and to think on we must build our sociology on that tension. Actually, the controversy in Japan is nourished not only by Japanese experts, but also by the foreign literature and foreign experts, like ICRP, IEA, WHO, UNSCARE, and also anti-nuclear experts, or people especially dealing with radiation risk, like Chris Busby or Michel Fennex. Last May in Geneva, they had a protest conference about to protest the fact that WHO is controlled by the nuclear industry under IEA and SCARE. Apologize. So another ironical fact about radiation, the fact that the radiation protection standards are based on epidemiology and mainly on the cohort of Hiroshima-Nagasaki survivor. Also, it's interesting to take a look at the various epidemiological studies that have been conducted on nuclear plant workers. One of these studies has been conducted over 15 countries. It took a lot of time. It's a huge cohort with more than 400,000 workers. The average cumulative dose of those workers in this study was 20 millisieverts for all their career. So it's interesting regarding the current controversy. And only 5% of them were exposed to a dose of 100 millisieverts a year. For the all carrier. And the conclusion of this study was that the increase for all cancers was 9.7%, excluding leukemia, and 19% for leukemia. So, it's of course it's not that it would not provoke a big pandemic of cancers, but it does increase the risk of cancer. So, and it's very different than to say there is no significant risk, as some experts argue. Well, for example, Professor Nagataki criticized this study when I talked to him about this study. He said, well, but the Canadian team protested that Professor Cardis, who conducted this study, committed a lot of deontological faults. And then again, I remember what Chris Busby say, like, some experts lie. They lie or they just repeat some rumors. And so I wanted to check with Professor Cardis herself. She used to be based in Lyon, where is located the ARC. She was the head of the Department of Radiation Risk at ARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the agency of WHO for the research on cancer. And she was head of that department for a long time. She has conducted a lot of surveys, not only on nuclear plant workers, but also on Hiroshima and Chernobyl. And, well, first of all, she told me that the controversy with Nuke Canadian was not from the Canadian team who were part of this survey, but from people working at NSCARE saying that there was some methodological problem with the Canadian data and so on. And then the Canadian team agreed to revise them, to check again all their data and so on. And the revision is about to be published. More interesting, she said that the problem of epidemiology is that, and for this I would like to hear Professor Jan comment, epidemiology has a lot of methodological constraints. So even if you want to prove that there is a high risk due to low dose radiation, it's not so easy to show it because of many methodological constraints, like the problem of confidence interval. I cannot go into detail. For those who are interested, please look at my paper in the book. Also, another interesting thing she mentioned is that about a famous report on Chernobyl, which used to be presented as the definitive report on Chernobyl by IEA when it was presented. Elizabeth Cardis has collaborated also with Professor Yamashita Shinichi for this report. And she said, I was very unlucky to be asked to present this report in Vienna in 2005. The day before, there was a press conference in London stating a maximum of 4,000 deaths. And this was based on old research, on old data. And I asked her, so who was in charge of the press release in Vienna? Was it WHO or IEA? She said, well, this is part of the problem. The people in charge were a mix of WHO and IEA. And were they epidemiologists or physicians? No. They were specialists in risk communication. So, of course, if IEA was there, you can imagine that they would push the presentation of the data toward the downplay of the risk. Okay, just to conclude very briefly about what would be a possible scenario in Taiwan regarding this situation if Taiwan was facing a similar situation. I remember that after 311, Xie Dezhi, was a vice minister of Atomic Energy Council at that time, said even if the 10 reactors of Fukushima Daiichi would explode and the wind would bring the whole radiation plumb in Taiwan, there would be no risk for Taiwan. And this prompted reaction from some scholars, including Professor Jan, and who organized a press conference to comment about this, because we did fear that that could be different. And actually, what is interesting is that Mr. Xie Dezhi is not. He can be critical on other topics, like for example, as regarding NP4, the situation of NP4, pushed him to resign from his position as Vice Ministry of AEC. So it's very interesting that how in Taiwan we tend to downplay the risk of low doses radiation. Okay, so sorry, I have to skip this for there's enough time. Let me just conclude in this is perhaps too simplistic scenario, but just as Professor Shi it's very interesting. You mentioned the prediction. It's not only for religion but also for science. Let me try some kind of sociological prediction. I guess that AEC, in case of a disaster similar to 311, for northern Taiwan, AEC will tend to limit the evacuation zone to a very limited perimeter. You know that after 311, the perimeter has been extended from 5 to 8 kilometers, compared to 20 or 30 kilometers in the case of Fukushima Daiichi. So one reason which led me to think this is that it has been stressed by anti-nuclear activists in Taiwan. The financial reserve is for decommissioning nuclear plants and also for evacuation, for crisis management, are far from insufficient. So, of course, there will be a strong pressure to limit the people to be evacuated because of this huge compensation burden. But the situation might be a little different in the south of Taiwan because the NP3 is a little far from Kaohsiung and Taitung, but I think we will have the same pressure to limit the perimeter of the evacuation zone. Okay, time is up. So I guess in that case, we will be compelled to live in Taipei, in Kaohsiung, in Taitung. There will be no evacuation plan for big cities like Taipei and Kaohsiung. So it means that we will be compelled to live in a background radiation risk which would have increased by 10 times, like if we are under 100 millisieverts. So it means that we will be forced to live in a situation very similar like the current situation of residents in Fukushima Prefecture. I think, so it means the situation of, for example, people living in Taipei is not comparable to the current situation of people living in Tokyo, but more in the current situation of people living in, let's say, Fukushima City, for example. And that will put us in a we will be compelled to live in this low dose, with low dose radiation risk. Thank you very much.